People often ask my opinion on what's a good inexpensive scaler or just a good first step into retro gaming on flat screen TVs. Well, today there's a new option, one that's absolutely excellent and works for many people in many different scenarios. Stay tuned for a review of the RetroTINK2x. The RetroTINK2x is a device that accepts composite, S-video, and component video from classic game consoles. It outputs 480p HDMI, making it compatible with all modern displays and capture cards. I wanted to speak to Mike Chi, the creator, about his device and go into detail about all the different features it has, but first I just wanted to start out asking him a basic question. What does it come with?
In terms of a kit, it'll come assembled with a plexiglass enclosure. Video output is provided by the mini HDMI, not micro, not the big one. It's a nice in-between size, which fits well on the small board. And you can get a cable from mini HDMI to the regular HDMI for your TV or a dongle. They're all pretty inexpensive. I'm going to see if we can, at least in the first batch, I'm going to include a HDMI cable so that you don't have to buy a mini HDMI. It's a full HDMI. Not sure if I'm always going to do that or if that's an option. I'll have to see it. But at least for the first batch of 50 or so, it's going to come with a cable as well.
Next, I asked Mike how he recommended people power the device. And while that might seem like a silly question, I've run into lots of issues over the years of devices that require a minimum wattage power supply, which means you can't just use a dinky little cell phone adapter. So I asked Mike to explain if there were any power requirements at all and what he recommended people use.
It's a good question. So the USB port is for power. The board consumption of the board should be under 500 milliamps. So that's most USB ports. A cheap iPhone charger would work just fine. For me, my HD TV has USB ports. A lot of TVs now have USB ports for plugging at a USB stick so you can play movies or pictures off of that. And it's just easy for me to plug it directly into the TV in that case.
Now that we have the basics down, I wanted to start asking questions about the different features of the device, starting with the output modes and what each does.
So the device has 3 modes. When you first power it up, it's in 2x mode. So it's taking the 15 kilohertz signal and doubling it to 31 kilohertz. So 240p to 480p or 480i to 480p. If you press the mode button, it's still doing line doubling, but it's also now doing vertical filtering. So it's smoothing out the edges. And some people like it, some people don't. If you're playing video games, it's kind of like the old emulator 2xi or the Super Eagle filter. I think it helps a lot with movies and reduces flicker because line doubling isn't exactly as robust as full deinterlacing. Press the button again, and it goes to what I call pass-through mode. So in this mode, it's basically digitizing the analog signal, but it's outputting it at the same scan rate. So if it's fed 240p, it's going to output 240p only now through the HDMI port. And some TVs will actually take that, and it'll work. Some TVs don't like it, and some TVs, if you do that, it'll add a huge amount of latency. And you press the mode button one more time, and it cycles back to the normal line doubling without smoothing, which gives you the blocky image, which a lot of people like.
So now that we heard descriptions and saw examples of each mode, I just want to show the 2x and the 2x filtered modes side by side so that you could get an idea of what that filtering really looks like. I prefer the 2x mode myself, but there's really no wrong way to do this. It really is just whichever your eyes prefer, and that might even change depending on the display or console that you're using. So far, the examples that I showed were from a Super Nintendo that outputs 240p. What I was really curious about is how the RetroTINK2x handles 480i signals, especially in games that switch between 240p and 480i. As an example, I used Artemio's 240p test suite and swapped between the modes just to see how quickly the TINK2x would recover and how my capture card reacted to it. As you can see, the transition time of the RetroTINK2x is just about the same through my capture card as using the open source scan converter, which in itself is a very quick transitioning device. I asked Mike his thoughts on what mode people should use when they're playing 480i content. I was wondering if you should leave it in pass-through mode and let your TV try to do the deinterlacing, or if you should always just leave it on the 2x 480p mode.
Yeah, I would always leave it in 480p mode if you're plugging it directly to an HD TV. If you leave it in the pass-through mode, most HD TVs will try to do deinterlacing, and that will add a lot of latency and probably add more problems when it tries to switch between 240p and 480i.
And speaking of latency, I want to talk about the lag test results, because that, in many cases, is the #1 problem with cheaper scalers. Some of the ones that are out there could actually have 5 or 6 frames of lag, which in my opinion could make most games just completely unplayable. So I put the RetroTINK2x through its paces, and I have 3 different captures showing you exactly how little lag is there. On the left is a Sony PVM monitor with the HD RetroVision cables going directly into it. There's no processing at all happening, it's just the original 240p resolution. Then I took the outputs of the PVM and put them into the RetroTINK2x. So I just ran component in, then component out into the 2x. Then that's going into an analog converter, which is going into a Sony BVM that accepts 480p. What you're looking at right now is an iPhone 240 frames per second slow motion capture. You can see that there's no perceivable lag and everything seems to line up. But let's switch over to a 480 frames per second slow motion camera. The quality of the image is pretty terrible, but if you just concentrate on the red circles, you'll be able to see that they hit exactly at the same time. Now let's try in 1000 frames per second. Even though the video quality is absolutely terrible, you can still see the numbers light up at the exact same time, proving there is no perceivable lag through the RetroTINK2x. That means everyone from casual gamers to competitive fighting game players can use this and not ever have to worry about lag. I wanted to ask Mike how he got the latency down so low and if there were any tricks he could share with us.
It's a good question. I can't take too much credit, and it's one of those cases where simpler is better. So the video scaler chip I use is very dumb. It doesn't have frame memory, so it can only do line doubling, where it takes one line and then immediately scans out the next one. So that's why latency is really low, because it's not trying to buffer a whole frame, scale, and an output. It's the simplest form of scaling, which is line doubling, and pretty similar to what the OSSC does. It works pretty well. There's some limitations. It can't do full deinterlacing of 480i to 480p for movies, but that really doesn't matter for what we're trying to do here. In short, it achieves low latency because it's very simple.
I wanted to compare the RetroTINK2x to some competition, but to be honest, I had a hard time deciding what that was. I don't really know of any device that's cheaper than the TINK2x that could even come close to the quality, and I wasn't sure if I should go that much higher end on devices, but in the end I settled on another community-made project, the open source scan converter. I feel like by taking the stock settings of the OSSC and leaving it on 2x output to match the 480p output of the TINK2x, I think that would be a good way to put them side by side and really see if there's a quality difference. I know if I went in and started tweaking all of the little settings of the OSSC, I might be able to get a better image, but I felt that that was an unfair advantage and not really the point of this. The TINK2x is half the price of the OSSC, so it's only fair that you should just expect it to work straightforward without a million features. I'll start out by showing Super Mario World, which is a game that most of us should recognize. I'm using the HD RetroVision component cables into both the RetroTINK2x and the open source scan converter. That way it's a completely fair comparison and it's using the highest possible quality that both devices can handle. As you can see, it's really impressive. In fact, I think both devices look great and I have a hard time seeing which one is a clear winner, if there is one at all. I also wanted to show Sonic 2, not just because it's an iconic game that we'd all recognize, but also because the opening demo sequence shows the 2-player mode, which switches into 480i. So once again, you could see the demonstration of switching and how quickly the capture card could recover on both devices. As you can see, both output an impressive picture quality and really great 480p. I honestly can't say if there's a distinctive winner between one or the other, but one of the things that really surprised me about the RetroTINK2x is how great the colors looked. I was under the impression that that device compresses the colors, and I was really shocked that they were able to come out so sharp and clear. I asked Mike if he could describe exactly what's going on and kind of explain that to us.
Yeah, so the video decoder chip does a really good job of color balancing and color processing. It's another one of those things where I can't take too much credit. It automatically adjusts the contrast and the brightness as well as the color balance based on the input signal. It does a pretty good job without the user having to do any adjustments. It also has something called chroma transient improvement, where it sharpens the color edges, since the bandwidth is really low in the S video as well as composite. So it tries to sharpen those edges up, which helps for video games. The default color output space for this chip is 422, and that's perfectly fine for composite and S video, since again the bandwidth is low to begin with. I'd say the 422 color space output is probably one of the limitations of this device in component mode, because you do lose some color bandwidth. And if you're looking at a static test image, for example, the empty test bar, you can see that in the along some of the color boundaries. But for video games where the picture is moving, it's not really a big deal. At least I personally can't tell the difference.
That was a pretty interesting explanation, because I honestly didn't see any of the color compression until putting the color bars one on top of the other like that. This isn't something that you would see in composite video or S video, because those formats actually compress the colors as part of the standard. But in component video, or of course in RGB, I could usually pick out which devices compressed colors. So it was pretty impressive that the RetroTINK2x was able to display it in a way where I couldn't tell the difference. And I usually can, because I spend an unhealthy amount of time staring at these things trying to figure out which is better. That talk did bring up composite and S video for the first time, so I want to jump a little bit into how those look and show examples of what that looks like in 480p. Here's Super Mario Bros. Running through an analog NT Mini's composite video output. As you can see, it's not the greatest signal, but as far as composite upscalers go, it does a fine job. Most of the composite upscalers I've seen add a lot of lag, and they even process the image as 480i, giving it that weird flicker. But as far as composite video goes, this is about as good as you're going to get. Here's S video, and this looks really impressive. I think anybody with a console and S video output would really be happy running this through the RetroTINK2x, especially if it's just your first stepping stone into gaming onto flat screens, because now you could really see, is this good enough for you? A zero lag solution that looks pretty darn good? Or are you interested in upgrading to higher end equipment? And here's all three formats just to demonstrate the difference. Composite looks okay, S video looks great, but of course component video is going to look the best. Still, it seems like a great scalar solution for an S video signal. When I was testing the three different inputs, I realized that you would still get a picture on the screen if you had the wrong input selected. It would just be in black and white. That led me to believe that the inputs are somehow connected on the inside, and so you can't use this as a video switch as well, which is kind of a cool bonus of the open source scan converter. You could have three different sources connected in at the same time and just select between them. So I wanted to verify with Mike if that was true and that we should not connect more than one source at the same time.
Unfortunately not, because the inputs, the video decoder chip itself only has three analog inputs. So if you're using component, it's using input 1, 2, and 3. If you're using composite, it's using input 1. And if you're using S video, it's input 1, 2. But all these pins are shared. So even though you have all the different ports, they're electrically tied together. So you can't connect more than one console. The signals would fight with each other. And that's also why you see a black and white image. So if you take the composite video output of your console, plug it into the green jack, and set it in component mode, it's going to interpret that as a black and white signal because it's going to the Luma channel of the component. You'll see the composite color artifacts in black and white. So in short, unfortunately, you can't use it as a switch, and that's because all the jacks are actually tied together.
As I was testing different consoles, I realized that none of them were outputting any of the aliasing jailbars that are commonly found when putting analog consoles directly into digital equipment, such as capture cards or flat-screen TVs. I thought that meant there must be a low-pass filter device on there, and I wanted to ask Mike which one he used and what megahertz filter he was putting on it.
Yeah, the video filter has a standard def video low anti-alias, which with a cutoff, I think 6 megahertz. So you're not going to see the aliasing effects. Now it does have the effect of making the edges a little bit more smooth, but given that you're at 480p, it's going to be a little bit blurry anyways. So I don't think it matters too much.
After testing multiple consoles over different formats, something became immediately apparent. Not one of my TVs or devices were failing when using the RetroTINK2x, whereas with the open source scan converter, there are many incompatible devices when using certain consoles or certain output modes. I wanted to ask Mike if he did anything with the sync signal or with the video signals in general in order to make them more compatible, because as far as I could tell, this is just a plug-and-play device that will work on anything that you use it with.
The device does sync regeneration, or actually more precisely, it does it adapts the video output clock. So it has the same number of pixel samples every line, even if the timing is off. So it changes the pixel clock slowly, but on average, it outputs the correct frame rate, and it outputs the exact same number of samples, so that you have perfect synchronization, even if the input is jittery. And the reason for that is because the video capture circuit is actually designed to tolerate something like a VCR, which is really bad, far worse than a Super Nintendo, and that helps a lot in outputting a correct signal. So far, I haven't been able to make it angry yet. I've cited some pretty bad sources.
Mike just mentioned VCRs, which is something I'm interested in as well. I know a lot of people with VHS tapes that they'd love to capture, and they even have great capture equipment, but that doesn't support composite or S-video. So I wanted to know if Mike felt the RetroTINK2x would be a good device to capture VHS tapes, and how he suggested we do it. Should we go in through the pass-through mode and take the raw 480i image and then use software deinterlacing either? Do we just capture it in 480p mode? Or should we try the filtered mode that he added?
Yeah, if you want to watch movies or capture VCRs, I would recommend. Well, there's a few. It depends on the use case. If you have a video processing, if you have a video conversion software that can do deinterlacing, it probably makes sense to capture it in pass-through mode and have the video processor do the deinterlacing. But if you want something simple, if you're watching it directly, I would convert it to 480p and turn on the filter. The filtering, people don't like it for games, but I think it makes a lot of sense for movies to smooth it out. One of the nice things about this card is that it has a 5-line comb filter. It's not going to be as good as the 3D comb filter and the really late consumer CRTs, but I think it does a really nice job of cleaning up composite sources, so you get a nice video, so you get a nice picture for watching movies.
Since we're talking about capturing and quality, I also wanted to ask about the audio chip that's built onto the RetroTINK2x. Since you have to take your console's audio and run it through that device, when you're capturing, I was wondering if Mike thought it would be better to break off the audio before the RetroTINK2x and go directly into a computer, or if the audio chip on there was good enough so that you didn't have to worry.
The audio sound is pretty simple. It uses a 24-bit analog to digital converter, which is then captured by the HDMI transmitter and sent along with the video. It's not a super fancy chip, but I made sure not to cheap out on getting a really bad one. I spent a few dollars, you can get a good audio capture chip. So it works pretty well. I'm sure if you were really measuring it on a test scope, you could probably find some jitter because the HDMI clock isn't perfectly synchronized with the audio clock, and there's probably some loss in the process. But I think, at least in my ears, it sounds really nice. And the only thing there is just to make sure to get a good audio capture chip.
So overall, it sounds like a pretty decent audio chip. If you're playing games, I would recommend just going right through the TINK2x and letting your TV or your stereo go from there. But if you're capturing, I would really leave it up to what quality equipment you have for audio capture. If you're going directly into your PC, which generally have noisy sound cards built onto the motherboard, definitely stick with the RetroTINK2x's audio. If you have other devices like USB audio, it might be the same, so maybe just give it a try and see what's best for you. But if you have higher end audio equipment like some digital stereo or music recording equipment, or of course if any of your devices have digital audio output, maybe then you would want to consider using a separate device to capture audio. But overall, the chip that's built in, I didn't have any issues with, I didn't hear any buzz or hum when I was playing, and overall I would just call it a good solution. Now that we've covered all of the features and settings of the RetroTINK2x, I wanted to talk about other uses for it. And the number one thing that comes to mind is people that can just get a very cheap HDMI to VGA converter. And that would allow you to take any CRT VGA monitor and turn it into a retro gaming display. That means you could just go to any thrift store and for usually only about $20, pick up a pretty decent CRT VGA monitor, and now you have a zero lag solution for all of your classic games. I think this is a pretty cool feature, and while the scan lines won't look the same as 240p, you're still going to get a really high quality CRT gaming experience with, most importantly, zero lag. So I wanted to ask Mike what he thought about that, and if he had anything else to add.
Yeah, so the analog output, we asked, I've gotten some requests to have a direct analog output on the board, but then I realized it's actually more expensive to try to bolt that on the board because these HDMI to VGA dongles are really cheap. And the nice thing about the cheap ones is that there's actually no latency. You're just taking the HDMI digital stream and decoding that, converting that directly to an analog signal without any buffering. So that's a really simple and high quality way to get RGB analog output from this board without any latency. You can use that to connect that to a CRT monitor that runs at 31 kilohertz, or if you have a BVM that only takes 480p. You can also feed it directly into an OSSC in pass-through mode. So that's feeding the OSSC a 240p signal, but with the component, with the RGB, with the composite or S video decoded to RGB, so the OSSC can take it. The nice thing is that the video decoder on the board is doing the anti-aliasing filter and digitization, so you don't need to have a low-pass filter on the OSSC to get a good image.
Mike just made 3 really important points. First of all, the reason VGA output isn't included on the RetroTINK2x is that the added cost of that would actually be more than just getting one of these HDMI to VGA dongles. And in that case, I think it's great that he didn't include it, because I don't think everybody that's buying this device would need a VGA output. So that way you don't incur the extra cost if you don't use it, and you could find some really great quality HDMI to VGA devices for under $20 that perform really well. They don't crush the black levels at all, and they really just give you a generic one-to-one conversion without doing any other processing and don't add any other lag. Also, if you remember in the lag test earlier, I'd used this one in a different converter as well, just to make sure. And even with all those devices connected together, it did not add any other lag to the experience. Next is the really big one though, the OSSC connections. Now, you might think, why would you want to buy this if you already had an open source scan converter? But the OSSC does not have composite or S-video inputs. And that's a pretty big deal. Up until now, the only way to get composite or S-video into an OSSC is using rare and expensive devices that convert those formats to RGB. There do exist VGA converters, but most of them are low quality and treat 240p signals as if they were 480i, resulting in a pretty bad gaming experience. Also, since they only output 480p, you're limited to the OSSC's 480p doubling to 960p, and you can't really take advantage of its awesome 240p multiplying. With the RetroTINK2x, you can connect your composite or S-video source, set the video output mode to pass-through, and then use an HDMI to VGA converter to go directly into the open source scan converter's VGA port. From there, you can use the different 240p multiplication modes that go up to 5x for 1080p, which is great for 1080p or 4K TVs. Also, you don't have to worry about the OSSC not having a low-pass filter on the VGA input, because that filtering is done directly on the RetroTINK2x. So now I want to show some demonstrations of what that actually looks like. First, here's composite video, which is being run through the RetroTINK's pass-through mode as 240p into the open source scan converter, upscaled 5x to 1080p. In all honesty, I kind of think just running it in 480p mode looked a little better than this, but let's check out S-video. Hey, look at that. Now we're talking. I think this is proof that people that need to upscale an S-video signal to 1080p can definitely use the RetroTINK2x through the OSSC in 5x mode, and I think it's a perfectly viable solution. This is great for anybody with older consoles that don't have RGB mods like the Commodore 64. So as you can see, there's still lots of uses for the RetroTINK2x, even in an analog environment. Heck, I bet you could even take one of those HDMI to VGA converters, build in a sync combiner circuit, and convert it to SCART. That way you could run your composite or S-video source through your existing RGB setup and use that for a full analog RGB monitor setup. I think that's a bit extreme, but who knows? I bet there's people out there that really just want to put one composite or one S-video source into their existing RGB switch setup, and this would be a great device for that. The one last analog question I did want to ask Mike was that, is there any chance of devices detecting the signal as 480p widescreen 16:9 as opposed to 480p 4:3, or should I just be able to plug this into any 4:3 monitor or device and not have it accidentally smush the image down into a 16:9 setting?
If you use the HDMI to VGA output, it should give you 4:3. The HDMI encoder, I think, is flagged to set the video output as 4:3. Now, having said that, some TVs are kind of annoying. They'll stretch it for you, and there's no way of changing it back. Some displays will override it, but it should be flagged as 4:3. And if your display has an option, you should be able to set it to the right aspect ratio.
One thing I was definitely curious about is a device that supports composite, S-video, and component is amazing, but why not include RGB as well?
Why no RGB? The short answer is because the chip doesn't support RGB. The video decoder chip I use only takes component, S-video, and composite. Would have loved to add RGB, but unfortunately it wasn't possible in this one. I could have built a RGB to component transcoder in analog as a front end and then feed that back into the chip, but you're not really gaining any benefit. And if you really wanted RGB input, I think the best thing to do is just to get a really simple RGB to component transcoder externally. From a personal perspective, and this is a bit selfish, but we never had RGB from our consoles anyways, so it doesn't bother me too much. The games, the systems we played with had composite S-video or if we're lucky component. We never had SCART, which for better or for worse.
I also wanted to know why Mike chose just a basic line double for 480p output and not do something crazy like do a 4K scaler.
Like to do 4K, like to do more than 480p, but there's two answers. The first is that the video processing chips that I use is limited to 480p. It can't go higher than that. So it's a physical limitation of the chips I use. I actually noodled around with a 4K scaler, and I think there's a chip that does it, but it's one of those things where you're going to spend probably half a year full time just engineering it, and like to do that actually, but I don't think it just comes back to a matter of time.
So while I'd love a 4K scaler, I'm really happy that Mike made the decision to keep this a low-cost product, because I really think because of its around $100 price point, it's going to be used by a wide variety of people for many different reasons, all of which we covered in this review. So I think it's great for people that are just starting out and maybe they have a Super Nintendo and a Nintendo that they just want to use on their flat screen TVs. Beautiful. Pick up an S-video cable pretty cheap for your SNES, use composite for the Nintendo, and go from there. Maybe if you'd like to squeeze out a little more quality, you could pick up an HD Retrovision cable for the Super Nintendo. Maybe not though. I think a lot of people are turned off by how much work and how much money it costs to mod a NES with the NES RGB kits or even the high-def NES. And while most of us that are striving for perfection don't mind, I think that is a big turnoff for some people. Of course, there's all the other uses we covered as just using it as a composite or S-video converter, either to HDMI or to VGA or even to RGB with the right conversion equipment, or really just as a way to get guaranteed compatibility for your captures. So maybe somebody would buy the OSSC and use that as their primary gaming device, but if they ever have issues with capture or going to use a separate monitor, you could use this because you know it'll be compatible with everything you throw at it. I could probably go on and reiterate and find another million different scenarios to use this thing, but I wanted to ask Mike who he thought the target user might be for a device like this.
As with many of these projects, you end up building devices that you yourself want to get, right? And then hopefully other people like it. So I'll just use myself as the prototypical user. So I'm a lazy person. I don't like to. I used to like tweaking a lot of stuff. So I'm gonna get an OSSC soon. I'm sure I'll have fun playing with it with the settings. But I'm lazy. Maybe I'm getting old, but I don't like to adjust a lot of things. I like stuff to work out of the box. So I'm thinking, really, this is the gamer that has a stock console, doesn't want to mod it, spend the time or the money or just the hassle. But they've got decent cables, S-video or component, and they want a reasonably good picture quality without having to do a lot of work for adjustment and something as close to plug and play as possible. So that's really the profile. Lazy gamer, decently good quality, but perhaps not obsessed with chasing the best possible, because of course there are ways, with an OSSC or FrameMeister to get something a bit better, but then you have to invest a lot more time and money.
Overall, I think the RetroTINK2x is filling a pretty big void in the retro gaming community. At its medium price point of about $100, I think it's the perfect entry-level device for people that want to start retro gaming on digital displays or capture cards. I also think that it's a device that has so many features that even if you upgrade to an open source scan converter or whatever comes next, that you'd still probably have a use for it afterwards. So it's not just a device you'd use at the start and then throw away when you're done, kind of like some of those cheap SCART to HDMI converters that add tons of lag. Because really at the end of the day, the experience is what it's all about, and having a device that's compatible with all the displays that I've tested it on and doesn't add any lag means that it does not take away from the gaming experience, unlike so many of those other devices. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel and check out the weekly podcast that keeps people up to date with all the awesome things going on in the retro gaming community, including cool new products like the RetroTINK2x. Also, if you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing to my Patreon, because without my amazing Patreon supporters, videos like this could never happen. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you guys next time.